Patrick Johnson, Merry Christmas to you. Merry Christmas to everyone watching, listening, reading. Yeah, there you go. Looked pretty classy. Not wearing Liverpool gear as usual, as I have been
Yeah,
through the
what
whole
a shock.
pandemic. Let's just kind of. We haven't done a video in a while, and I will start by saying this video is brought to you by Woody's RV, woodysrv.ca, Western Canada's largest selection of RVs, because you might just want to get an RV and isolate yourself these days.
Yeah,
Things are
we
going.
don't have to
It's
see anybody.
yeah, just you know what? I could use that right about now. Woody's, hit me up if you want to give me something to test drive. I'll happily take an RV off your hands. So thank you to Woody's for their sponsorship of this. Bit of a crazy last couple of weeks. We've known that how the NHL has dealt with the virus. The Canucks in the center of it again, one of the first teams to have to cancel games. What's this been like for you, being in and around this and this uncertainty, even going forward? Like, we were just talking before we started about coverage plans for next week.
Yeah.
We don't know if the game's going to go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, the plans for now is that they'll play the Kraken on Monday, I guess. And then in theory, they're supposed to go to the U.S. For 3 games, including returning to Seattle on Saturday, the 1st. Anyway, I mean, a little bit of deja vu, just in terms of worry. But it was different. I mean, you heard, of course, what the Flames were going through, and quite quickly you're like, oh my God, this is probably this Omicron, because it happened so fast. And then, of course, worrying about the Canucks. And then, Luke Shen told us the other day that he was told essentially that I guess based on, I mean, I figured this out again, based on the sort of science that they can do right at the sort of initial lab level, that it was presumed that this was an Omicron case, which, is pretty amazing given how quickly that's supposed to infect people, that they didn't get it on the whole team again. But again, the vaccinations changed this whole aspect of the story. And, we are seeing how other leagues are handling this. The NFL is just not going to, they're only going to test symptomatic people. They're basically turning themselves into BC, which, I kind of find interesting. I mean, I get, when they were unvaccinated, there was an obvious argument for why they needed to do as much testing as they could, because they just needed to keep things secure and safe and keep people healthy. And, Brandon Sutter is an example of what, essentially could happen if it all had gone wrong. So all those things were kind of in the back of my head. What does this really mean? How much risk are these guys actually at this point, based on everything we know, where they've been, what they've done? So that was the other thing that kind of jumped out at me, was that just trying to remember the reality of it all, and the fact that in many ways, the NHL has kind of become a grand experiment, in terms of how each league is its own experiment, but how they're handling, they've made their own policy. Most of it's been science-based, and sort of seeing how this works in essentially a group of healthy individuals. And, fingers crossed to this point. I mean, I know there's, 100 some people in COVID protocol with the NHL right now, but fingers crossed, so far so good, that everything's been mild, and that, in essence, that is how it's supposed to go for most people in the broader community, and perhaps a window into sort of where we're going to be moving into in the next sort of phase, once we're sort of past Omicron. And again, fingers crossed, as we understand, and more treatments come online, and the vaccines continue to improve, and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up other leagues. Obviously, the NFL shuffled around a few games. You hear you have the Cleveland Browns now having to play on a Monday and a Saturday because their game got pushed back. The NBA certainly has had much more of a difficulty because they have smaller teams. I mean, again, you talk about science; it's just natural that's going to happen. You lose 3 or 4 players, it makes a massive difference. Premier League has been, some teams are able to postpone games, other teams aren't, and there's no rhyme or reason for it. Some teams are announcing, these are the players that have got COVID, we're going to go without it. Other teams are like, no, we have no idea who. Yeah. So the one savior for the NHL may be the Olympics. The fact they built this cushion into their schedule, and now they're not going. Number one, how do you think this is going to impact the rest of the season? Because right now it's fine. It's, everything's exploding, but you've got this buffer. But if it continues to go that way, what have you heard about contingency plans for that? And then I'd like you to touch on how you think the players feel about not going to the Olympics.
Well, one of the things I put together, I'll touch on the last one first. One of the things I put together or in fact, the last thing I put together for Christmas is essentially a Christmas wish list. And I went through the whole roster and thought about, what might this guy want in hockey terms. And the last guy on my list was Jarl Halak. And, we haven't talked a lot about him, just because we haven't, and partly just because of the nature of how our media access works. But he's a guy, he's kind of considered to be, classical, a bit of a goofy personality, but just quality, long-standing guy. He's been in the league a long time. And you don't stick around. I think, I know when he was in Long Island, he had a challenging time because he obviously ended up in the minors and didn't live up to the contract he'd signed. But in the end, there's a statement about a guy who has been able to stick with it, right? He stayed in a winning organization in Boston, and by all accounts has been he's a good, solid teammate, a guy who understands his role. And he was one of the first three people. Each country named their long list for the World Cup. Their first three people that were going to be on the team, and Jarl Halak was on Slovakia's, and he's not going, and that sucks. He's a guy that he's at the tail end of his career, and he will have gone there dreaming of a medal. And so, a guy like him, it's going to be a tough pill to swallow. I suppose in some reality, maybe he could go to the Canucks and say, "Hey, can I get a loan to go to the Olympics?"
Why would you do that?
But why would you do that?
Because if Demko ends up with COVID, it's just,
exactly. You got Mikey DiPietro, but realistically, it's not going to happen. Brad Shaw, who most people probably didn't realize, but Brad Shaw was consulting with the Italian team, and I think was kind of hoping that he would get to go.
Tears in his eyes.
We know people that are going to be very sad about that.
Yeah.
But
his 6-year-old daughter has been dreaming of him going to the and playing in the Olympics. But
his grown children. Yeah. But anyway, in the end, it's so that part of it. In the end, and Steve Stamkos. People have pointed out Steve Stamkos is going to be an old dude the next time. It's probably his window's closed, and so it's just kind of weird that it is that kind of reminder about how hockey has this weird relationship with international sport, and. So here we are. Anyway, that's
I'm laughing because Steve Stamkos can, dry his tears with $1,000 bills and stay at home and polish his Stanley Cup rings. So there's some guys, but I get it. I'm not being unsentimental, guy. Yeah. I love the fact that the Olympics has become something that young kids growing up as hockey fans can dream about playing. Because when it first went in the Olympics with the pros, I actually got to go to Japan in 1998 when the NHL was involved for the first time. The infamous Mark Crawford not using Gretzky in the shootout, whole time. And there's this huge debate. We know that the owners don't want to go there because they're losing money. But at the same time, kids watching that at that point thought, wow, wasn't it great to see Crosby score the golden goal here in Vancouver? And then, here we are 11 years later, that's something that they want to do. I think international sport, playing for your country in so many other sports, as Patrick, big rugby fan, it's the highest honor. And I think the Olympics was building some real momentum towards that. But obviously it makes sense not to go. I personally would love to see them put it in the Summer Olympics. I know it doesn't make sense. They play on ice, but it's off season. The NBA is played the same time of year and they go to the Summer Olympics, so,
right.
But whatever, those are conversations to be had down the road.
Just to be clear, Italy actually isn't in this Olympics, but they were kind of hoping to be there. Brad Shaw was involved with it. I'm just sort of thinking big picture. All the kind of people.
The American team is look at the potential representation from the Canucks there.
Exactly. Yeah. So anyway, what were your other questions?
My other one was how do you think, as we're in this maelstrom before Christmas? Number one, you had a natural Christmas break, even though it was just a few days anyway, and then you've got the Olympic break to make up these games, but. What about the rest of the season? If they come back in January and this is, COVID's not a thing that, this was put forward in the Premier League. Let's take a 2-week break as a circuit breaker or a firewall. This isn't going away in 2 weeks. So what's your sense of how this could be handled going forward?
Well, there's certainly a lot of discussion about, who should you be diagnosing and what is this all for? And I think actually, especially in their terms, they're ahead of the curve in that sense with the rest of us, because to the NHL's credit, they got everybody vaccinated but one player. And that player, by the way, is now essentially the target of his competitors on the ice for his own lack of interest in the plight of his fellow man and women. And he, so you're in this spot where they're like, okay, we did everything we were told to do. We got vaccinated. We're clearly not having huge issues with people getting infected. There is a new variant, of course. But are they going to become a window into sort of where we're going into the next stage, which is people are going to get sick? And is there going to be pressure? I mean, they're not, like I said, they're not having health issues because they're in good shape. They're healthy already. There's inevitably going to be people at risk. But they've sort of established themselves into that pattern of what we are all hoping that our society will become, which is, essentially closer to what we were before, and people will get sick and some people will go to hospital, but it won't be, it won't be a challenge for society to cope with in the way that, I think we're still making sure it's not, because in the end we can't have our hospitals overwhelmed. That's why we still have all these policies. So I do sort of feel that at some point, they're going to basically say, I mean, this is how they've always done it, which rightly or wrongly, they've always gone, okay, who's the doctor who will say X, Y, Z, right? Which isn't how you should make policy, but that's how they've operated. Now, in this case, there is sort of, like I said, I mean, you look at how things have shifted, like Vancouver Coastal Health this week. I mean, as I understand it, Fraser Health as well, although it doesn't say it on their website. But if you are fully vaccinated and you are confirmed with COVID, the isolation window is only 7 days now, right? Yeah. Because essentially the science is clear that if, like, after day 6 even, your chance of infecting other people is extremely low. And in fact, essentially, I think the data says no one does. So, there was this being cautious thing that we had initially because, when we weren't vaccinated, 10 days was the clear issue. Well, that's been shortened. So, I think that's, for instance, I believe how Luke Shen was able to get out of his quarantine so fast, or at least what we thought was his quarantine, or isolation, because in the end, those were the rules. Vancouver Coastal Health changed the isolation rules on the weekend. They shortened the window because basically they said no one needs to stay beyond 7 days anymore. It's not a problem. The science is shifting. So I think the NHL is going to do everything. I do really think that's going to happen. I don't know necessarily whether it'll be next week that they'll start saying we're going to start changing how we do this. But certainly for the next time being, because of Omicron, because of that presence, because of the risk, because of the sort of time of year, they're going to be pretty clear on their restrictions for now because these are the rules they've accepted. And but I will not be surprised if sometime in January they say, okay, we're changing how we're doing this. But again, that's likely going to happen for everybody.
This whole thing is, it's on the fly. It's such a fluid situation, to be honest with you. So, next week, you and I are both working. So we will, hopefully there will be games to talk about. What next week we're going to do is sort of a year-end look at this past crazy year that we've had for the Canucks. But I did want to finish here today. Let's talk about some hockey stuff. If there is a silver lining for the Canucks, they're obviously in the midst of, quite frankly, there's no other way to say it, a historic streak from the point where they changed their coach. Obviously, they had that little sort of mini camp, which was something that the coach really wanted. What are you expecting to see on the ice when they come back?
I mean, to be honest, not much different. I mean, Boudreau, obviously, as everyone's pointed out, has them playing a more aggressive style, a style that ironically was is more similar to what Travis Green had been doing before this season. And then in the end, Green's sort of decision to choose safe carried through on the old Torts axiom, which is safe as death. And we saw what happened. It didn't get them anywhere. So they're going to go after things aggressively. They're going to make mistakes. It's kind of wild looking at some of the numbers, and I wrote a bit of the numbers on Wednesday as well. Brock Besser's been playing great. He wasn't scoring for a long time, but honestly, I thought he was still playing really well. Now they've kind of loosened the screws a little bit, and they're going for it. And he's playing on a really interesting line with JT Miller and Tanner Pearson, and he's got 5 goals in 6 games. But the underlying numbers have always been there. Tyler Myers is a high event player. A lot of things happen, good and bad, when he's on the ice. Lately, it's been really good. Some of that's because he's been playing with Quinn Hughes. We'll see how that plays out. There's a lot of interesting things. We thought there would be interesting things about this team. I was never thought there was enough interesting things to make them truly a playoff team, and I still think that's a huge challenge. And they lean on their goaltender a whole ton. And Thatcher Demko has been amazing for the most part. So I think all those things will hold true. This is a team that has some clear strengths, and they need to keep playing to them, which is what Boudreau is doing to them. They're going to have some real concerns defending, which we've seen even in 6 games with him. and they're going to need big performance from their goalie, which is essentially the story of the team in 2019-20 when they ran all the way. They had that fun playoff run and hit the wall against a much more disciplined, much deeper, much more organized team in the Vegas Golden Knights. In the end, the kind of team that they want to become, and they just aren't there yet. And that's what Jim Rutherford's job is. He talked about we need to see what they look like on that big road trip in January and really to gauge where we're at. And in the end, that's where everything's at.
I want to finish by touching on something you just said when you said that fun playoff run that they had, because you and I had this conversation offline a couple of weeks ago. When you look at the demeanor of guys like Jim Benning, Travis Green, go back to Willie, Torts, this kind of dour, tense, stress, like hockey is ultra important. And I get it's a billion-dollar business. But man, charisma and fun and energy goes a long way, doesn't it? I mean, it's a game, for God's sake.
Yeah.
And I look at, we spent the first part of this video talking about this, horrendous global event that has just had us in its jaws for almost 2 years now. And the reason sports are still going on is, they're irrelevant, but they can give us some happiness, give us some fun, get us away from this. It's the same for the players and for the coach. And look, I'm not suggesting that if they go on and lose 6 or 7 games, Boudreau's not going to be really prickly and angry. But man, his personality seems to have been, no pun intended, infectious with this group, has it not?
Yeah, no, exactly. It's, you think about the most, in the end, successful politicians, the most successful leaders, and inherently you want to have an intelligence. You need to have a practicality and ability to get stuff done. But the most effective ones are always the ones you want to actually spend time with, right? And actually like call up and see all the time. And clearly that's clearly been a thing that's, it's interesting, the culture word. Francesco Aquilini brings that up. And I don't think you create culture to snap of the fingers. And, I hope he understands that. But, there is a sort of a competency that comes with that. But yeah, just an ability to, sort of say, what's the best way of doing this and have some fun with it. And they've got that right now. And that makes a big difference. Just as a side note, before we go, similar terms, a bit of a sad report, but this is what I'm thinking about. Bob McCammon, just turns out he passed away at age 80. I know he'd been having some health issues in recent years and certainly, but was so well thought of by his players. I talked to Stan Smeal about it. I tweeted a bit about this.
Yep.
McCammon and Jack McElhargy. Jack McElhargy, one of the toughest guys in the NHL, but especially the 88-89 season, a team that couldn't score but could play some defense and almost upset the Flames. Smeal told me before every game, those guys would tell a joke. They would have some new joke to tell the players. So the players went on the ice and they were just loose and they weren't, they weren't thinking about it. And you sort of you think about some of the taskmasters that are out there and who maybe are guilty of overthinking and worried about sort of that part of the game. And they're just like, nah, just go have some fun. This is a sport.
I remember going to games during that era, Patrick, with my dad, and they had started doing the post-game show with McCammon in that center ice restaurant after the game. Right. And there was a clamor to get in there. Because people were almost more engaged in the coach and what he had to say and how he said it versus what the Canucks were serving on the ice at the time. So that is really interesting. And let's tie this all together. Winning is contagious, isn't it?
It is. It really is.
It's not the only thing that is, sadly. Best of the season to you and your family. Best of the season to everyone listening, watching. Let's try and be nicer and kinder in this coming year in terms of how we interact with people who cover sports and people who follow sports. It can get pretty nasty out there, but it's meant to be a distraction from all the bad stuff. So let's keep that going. Thanks to Woody's RV, woodysrv.ca, for their sponsorship of this. And we will talk to you next week to a special sort of season end look at the Canucks.
Happy holidays, everyone.